All right, on this historic day, we've brought in 3 historians to help us put it all in perspective. Peter Onuf is a history professor at the University of Virginia. Ed Ayers is a historian and also the president of the University of Richmond. And Brian Ballo is a University of Virginia history professor. Together, they're the hosts of the public radio program BackStory with the American History Guys, which is a great look at what really matters, which is how we got where we are. And obviously, you all are so aware of how many second terms have dissolved into crisis or scandal. We were just going through what happened with President George W. Bush with the Iraq War and President Clinton with his personal indiscretion with Monica Lewinsky. So why have presidents struggled so much with a second term? You would think this is the term that, you know, nothing matters in a good way. You can go make a difference, but it doesn't always happen that way.
Yeah, but I think we have to look at the percentages, Aaron. I mean, to get to the second term, you probably did pretty well in your first term, right? And over the course of 8 years, it's not that unusual for a president to stumble or have a problem. So I think we got to look at presidents over the whole 8 years and get away from this second term curse.
Yeah, well, familiarity does breed contempt. You could go back to George. No, we're not on too much. I mean, George Washington had a lousy second term, relatively speaking. He was the father of his country. No parties, unanimous choice of the American people. Well, we don't like to talk about it, but people were taking a lot of pot shots at him in the second term because that's when the Republican, that is the Jeffersonian Republican Party, emerged. It was a tough time. He wanted to quit after his first term. They wouldn't let him, and he was sorry he had.
And they just throw things at him.
Well,
Talk about gratefulness.
Then he died in 1799, and everybody made believe
loved him.
This hadn't happened. They loved him.
Well, we talk all the time about, you know, maybe it's something of the cable era, or the Twitterverse era, the internet era, but the country's never been so divided. It's never been so partisan. It's never been so polarized. Pre-TV, pre-radio. If you go back and read the history books, this is pretty tame.
Well, to build on your earlier question, we don't have anybody with second term for most of the 19th century. There are no second acts. You know, Abraham Lincoln's reelected, but doesn't really get to serve it out. But all the way from Andrew Jackson throughout the entire rest of the century, except for Ulysses Grant, there's no second term.
Who has a lousy second term.
Yeah. So I think, you know, think what's partisan, they thought, each generation thought, oh gosh, now it's the worst it's ever been for 200 years.
It's got to be a whole lot harder now to go down in history as a good president, though, right? Because of social media, because, you know, you're never going to be able to ignore all the nasty things, and often nasty outweighs nice when it comes to the internet.
I'm going to turn to Peter because there was so much nastiness back in his time. And he had, like, all those presidents had 2 terms in a row.
No, look, John Adams has only recovered his reputation in the last few years.
And it took a movie to do that.
And he was reviled. He was considered a monarchist and a pseudo-aristocrat. The partisanship of the 1790s was absolutely vicious. You wouldn't believe it.
And one of the things that we worry about is so much the Democrats versus Republicans, but it's when you don't have those 2 structures that things really fall apart. You know, that you talk about the Civil War coming, there's nobody in charge. And so, ironically, the very thing that feeds this also contains it and channels it.
We will focus a lot tomorrow on the president's big moment will be the speech.
Right.
And the American people will watch, some people around the world will watch. What does history tell us about the importance of inaugural addresses, and is there any distinction between a first and a second?
Yeah, I think in a second inaugural address, the tone is always a little more subdued. The ambitions are usually a little lower. Now, Franklin D. Roosevelt laid out a very ambitious agenda to help the common man in his second inaugural. But in general, I think the president is a little bit chastened by the time of their second inaugural.
I mean, Washington only spoke 135 words.
And Abraham...
That guy really didn't want the job.
But he did anticipate Twitter.
Right, yeah.
That's 140 words.
Yeah, half his words were quit. No.
At Mount Vernon. That was.
But if you think of what is usually considered the greatest inaugural speech, Lincoln's second inaugural speech, it's also brief, and people at the time said, we're the policy directors. What's he going to do? What's this kind of forgiveness and providence?
Well,
whatever's
good speeches lasted for hours in the 19th century. That was entertainment.
Well, thank God times have changed on that front.
Gentlemen, we want to circle back. We'll circle back after tomorrow and see what you think of the moment, and then maybe we'll circle back in 50 years, right? When we get a much better flavor of what this means. Thank you so much for your help.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks
very much.
Thank you.
Yes.